Thank you so much, Ivan, for introductions. I'm very excited to present at this seminar, and in particular, excited to see some diversity in the audience. I can see that there are lots of former students and colleagues from Nazarbayev University here, which provide me some feedback on the thoughts that I will be talking about. And also, it's nice to have you, originally from Russia, so I would be very interested to bounce some of my ideas at you at the end. And also, and people from, I can see probably from Turkey and Eastern Europe, that will be another more neutral light eye at what I will be talking about. So I will share my slides first. Just a second, okay. Okay. Can you see the presentation? Okay, so I will switch to the slideshow mode. So the title of my presentation, In the Shadow of Giants, Marginalization and Agency of Kazakhstan Scholars in a Shifting Geopolitical Landscape. And so I hope you will appreciate the AI images that I generated using my artistic side, because I think they perfectly explain exactly what I will be talking about. And Bolashak, for some of you who don't know, is the program in Kazakhstan, which is sponsored by the government to send students to study abroad, for degree study abroad, and usually to like top universities around the world. So what is the purpose of my presentation? Honestly, this is not an empirical based presentation. What I'm using this presentation for is a way to reflect upon my previous research, long-term research, and as well as combine the results of this previous empirical research with ideas from post-colonial and decoloniality theories to reflect upon how complex interplay of neocolonial forces combined with the mechanisms of neoliberal capitalism affect local scholars in Kazakhstan, different types of local scholars in Kazakhstan. And I wanted to bring to your attention the fact that most of my previous research was actually empirical. So I didn't have that many experiences to kind of think more analytically about issues. So treat it as a first attempt, and I hope it will be interesting despite my lack of experience in that sense. So before I start to talk about things, I wanted to talk a little bit about my positionality. And in terms of my positionality, I define myself as an intellectual caravaner or an epistemic nomad. The one who traverses the silk routes of knowledge, carrying back and forth the intellectual traditions of east to south, west to north, forever moving, but nowhere at home. And that probably describes lots of people like myself from Kazakhstan who studied in the West or in other countries and kind of never stopped moving. Maybe it's just in the nature of our genetic code. I was born during the Soviet times, so I actually graduated from high school approximately at the time when Kazakhstan became independent. And in that sense, I'm the product of two different epochs, Soviet epoch and the post-Soviet Kazakhstani independence epoch. And importantly, I am primarily Russian speaking. In fact, when I went to school, I went to a Russian school, so I never learned Kazakh at school. I also lived in a very urban industrialized area, and most of the peers and people around were Russian speaking. So that's an important part of my identity that unfortunately, I don't speak Kazakh that well. So, and that defines my thinking, because if you were talking to somebody who is Kazakh speaking, they will probably have different opinions. As I said, I was introduced to university education in independent Kazakhstan. So I actually studied for 3 years at a Kazakhstani university, but I completed most of my education in the US. So I graduated with a bachelor's, master's, and PhD degree in the US. I got socialized into profession at a Western-style university, Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan upon return. So my experiences and my understanding of universities as an employee are based on this idealistic world of Nazarbayev University. And I know the experience of faculty members and students in ordinary Kazakhstani university just as a scholar by conducting interviews with them and by observation, and from my minimal experience studying for 3 years in the early independent times. I then immigrated to Canada. So I have now spent 7 years in Canada. I immigrated as a dependent, which means that I didn't get the job and I didn't immigrate because I got the job in Canada. I have to go through many struggles of integration into Canadian society. So when I came to Canada, I heard lots of discourse that as an immigrant, I have to forget about my previous education, previous work experience, it doesn't count. And in reality, I had to start from the beginning. I was an associate professor when I left Nazarbayev University. I had to complete another postdoctoral position and work as a part-time instructor before I managed to land a position at a Canadian university. And I was hired only at the level of assistant professor. So increasingly, I'm interested to visit and understand China. So that talking about my mobility through the Silk Route, because this is an important part of the Silk Route. So I kind of understand many aspects of the West, of of Russia and Kazakhstani side of it, Central Asian side of it. But I think to have the complete picture, I need to understand China better. And that's what I miss and need to probably focus on. And the reason why I'm at a caravaner, in a sense, is because I'm nowhere really. I'm constantly doubting my ability and right to speak on behalf of anyone but myself. Because when I was in the US, I experienced the US system, but I never became truly American. In Kazakhstan, I don't know whether I'm truly Kazakhstani given my Western education and lack of Kazakh language knowledge. And in Canada, I'm still an immigrant in transition. So I'm a caravaner in that sense. So now the focus of my exploration is Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan, there's lots of disagreement about whether it's post-colonial state or not post-colonial state. And the reason for that is as follows. So Kazakhstan was part of the Russian Empire, and then it became a part of the USSR. So Russian Empire for sure colonized Kazakhstan, but whether it was a colony in the Soviet times, there is some disagreement about that. On the one hand, Soviets used some common colonial approaches. For example, they persecuted local intelligentsia. They used linguistic and cultural Russification or assimilation of the local population. There was forceful settlement of nomads. There was programmed immigration, like policy determined immigration and demographic engineering. There was centralized political control from the colonial center. And also Kazakhstan has been used mostly for resource extraction, and there was lots of environmental neglect. So all of these are features of a typical colonial, countries that experience colonial past. On the other hand, the reason why not everybody agrees the past was colonial is because during the Soviet period, there were also some positive gains, which are not typical for colonial states. Soviets, as everybody knows, raised literacy rates. They also, implemented educational massification, industrialization. They cultivated new local political, cultural, and scientific elites. So there were lots of Kazakhs who received education in Russian universities and in local universities. And so there was also positive heritage. These colonial or post-Soviet legacies, they also continue in Kazakhstan nowadays. For example, there is some corruption, which I think is the legacy of the Soviet times. There is centralization of power. Lots of people like to talk about Kazakhstan as a dictatorial state. That's not my view. I think we have a heavily centralized power, but not necessarily like dictatorial in a conventional sense of it. Persisting problems with bilingualism or now trilingualism, and very strong integration with other post-Soviet states, which has been declining somewhat with some of those countries, but still persisting integration, especially with other Central Asian republics. I also, for the purposes of this presentation, I want to treat Kazakhstan of course, as a semi-periphery, because that's what you asked me to talk about. But I think it's an unusual semi-periphery because it's an overlaid semi-periphery. And what I wanted to reflect upon is how this overlaid property influences the semi-peripheral dynamics. So it is semi-periphery because it's a relatively well-off country because it has lots of oil resources and its economy is sort of flourishing, especially in comparison with some other post-Soviet states. But because it is landlocked and because it is extractive and lags in the development of science and technology, it cannot be considered a central state. It's neither periphery nor the center. It also have continued political, economic, and military ties with Russia. And of course, these ties have weakened as a result of the war in Ukraine, but there is this former colonial influences. In addition to that, there's economic and political influence of China. So we can think about Belt and Road Initiative and increasing importance of that initiative, as well as the West. So there are three colonial or neo-colonizing states or powers that are trying to control the country. And in that sense, it is an overlaid periphery. So it is a somewhat strong as a key player on the grand chessboard and the transformative magic of having access to oil, but it is semi-periphery because it's not completely on the margins, and overlaid because it's simultaneously recolonized by several powers. Now, if we talk about Kazakhstani academia, Kazakhstan's academia also has lots of properties of this semi-peripheral post-colonial state, because it's kind of lost in transition, forever lost in transition, and it has several properties associated with that. First of all, there is this perpetual remodernization. During the Soviet times, the former colonizer was proud of and it continues to be proud of the fact that Kazakhstan is its past modernization project. It claims the role in the establishment and development of Kazakhstani intelligentsia, higher education, and research. On the other hand, the new colonizer, the West, kind of at the time when the Soviet Union collapsed, diagnosed the old colonial structures as outdated and urged Kazakhstani government to introduce more modern mechanisms associated with neoliberal capitalism. This new modernization project has lasted for 30 years of independence, but it has never ended, and nobody perceives that we have achieved this state of complete modernization. So we are yet to see the end with a never-ending reform and an endless lineup of quickly changing initiatives. So there's a row of all sorts of reforms that keep changing one another. At first, there was privatization, then there was Bologna process, then there was the process of accreditation and focus on rankings. Then there was creation of world-class universities. Nowadays, Kazakhstan is trying to become a higher education hub. So, is there an ever end for us to emerge in a fully fledged modern educational system? There are always issues with it. And there's also an emerging colonizer at the background, China, which started to introduce some initiatives suggesting an alternative remodernization. Because if you think deeply, many of the Chinese claims around Belt and Road Initiative are also related to the desire to kind of remodernize and renovate and return the old Silk Route in a new format. And it's probably not observed to the same extent in educational initiatives, but I can imagine that in the future, China will also have claims for remodernization of education in Kazakhstan, especially with expanding ties of Kazakhstani universities with China. And this perpetual modernization also creates the sense of liminality or ambiguity or disorientation, because there's a confusion about what is modern, and it explains surprising persistence of some Soviet practices, attitudes, and approaches which coexist with the newly introduced Western ones. For example, Kazakhstan is, joined Bologna process with the original assumption that something is wrong with the doctoral program, the way it functions from the post-Soviet times. So we introduced all of the European and Western mechanisms, but at the same time, there was this sense of superiority of the Soviet doctoral degree over PhD. So lots of the old school professors would say that, well, the quality of preparation in PhD is never the same. The Soviet doctorate was higher. Or, for example, that centralized dissertation committees, which exist at the national level, provide higher quality of assessment for doctoral programs than school-based dissertation committees. Or, for example, this belief of many academics for a long time before the beginning of the war with Ukraine about superiority of Russian journals over Kazakhstani journals. So for some reason, they continue to believe that it's better to publish in the Russian venues. And also lack of satisfaction with the ongoing reform ends are never achieved, which leads to consideration of alternatives. So that may essentially push our system to consider some of the ideas from China, from another colonizer. And there is also mimicry, using the ideas from Homi Bhabha. So this ambiguity and this pressures from different processes of modernization leads to emergence of sometimes convoluted mechanisms of dealing with this ambiguity and unpredictability. For example, there are joint universities. So like, Kazakhstani system tried to build connections both with all sorts of colonizers. So there are Russian Kazakh universities, there are Kazakh British universities, Kazakh American universities, like kind of the never-ending Kazakhstani balancing between different geopolitical powers, which manifests in universities. There's also predatory publishing, pretending that you publish proper journal articles versus actual publishing, corruption, ghost authorship, and etc. All of these essentially create an image of successfully persisting or newly created colonial structures. But this is only on the surface, not real change in reality. So by having Russian Kazakh university, you sort of produce an impression as if you are still keeping in touch with Russians. By creating British Kazakh university, you also produce an impression that you are keeping in touch with the British state, colony. But in reality, if you dig deeper, neither of these universities have any that many properties or connections with either of the empires. It's all on the surface. So much mimicry, as I said. Now, and now if we look at the history of how this relationship with colonial powers have been changing over time, there was actually some emergence of indigenous agency and decolonization efforts at the very dawn of independence. I would say in the first 10 years of independence, we actually tried to restore and to create our own indigenous things and structures. Because there was excitement about newly gained independence, there was rise in national aspirations and nationalism and aspirations to find our own way and of course, we tried to learn from the world. That was the reason why Bolshak program, for example, was created, not imitate things, but to learn from the world and to create something of our own. There were also efforts aimed at the restoration of the Kazakh language, much more serious than they are now, with the implementation of trilingual policy when English gradually comes into the center. Including in the construction of the modern formal and scientific language. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, scientific Kazakh was not as developed because most of Kazakhstani Kazakh-speaking intelligentsia were actually Russian-speaking, technical intelligentsia were Russian-speaking, whereas Kazakh-speaking intelligentsia, they were mostly in humanities. They focused on Kazakh history, Kazakh literature, philology. So scientific Kazakh and formal Kazakh were not as developed. And in the early decade of independence, there were attempts to create and to systematically formalize with government resources sent for that purpose, this formal and scientific language. Also, efforts aimed at reclaiming the Kazakh version of history, literature, and art. I remember my days as a high school student when there were not that many books by Kazakhstani authors, but we kind of devoured all of these first history books, and we were so interested to read another interpretation, not the one that was provided by the Soviet textbooks and not the one in the Western textbooks. Efforts to create indigenous epistemologies. So as an example, in the early days, there were lots of conversations about ethnopedagogy in education. So for example, in trying to develop methods for teaching Kazakh, lots of faculty members were trying to use not the foreign approaches to teaching languages, but actually culture-based ethnopedagogical approaches. And they were trying to instill both cultural values and cultural understanding together with the language. Emergence of local systems of knowledge dissemination in the native language and with local topics. So as I said, there was an attempt to produce local textbooks, but also the emergence of some local journals publishing in Kazakh on local topics. And finally, some strengthening of the prestige of local scholars. Of course, in the early days, it was mostly historical scholars. So like we started to talk about Satpayev, for example, and some other Kazakhstani scholars that emerged during the Soviet times or even the Russian colonial times, and the kind of contribution they made for our knowledge. And everybody was proud of these people. There was pride in local knowledge and achievements from the past. At the same time, this early decolonization efforts, they had some complexity because many Kazakhs continued to have this internalized oppression or internalized inferiority. There was persisting subconscious belief in inferiority when compared with the Russian brother and the need to modernize further to catch up with the Russian brother. There was also hybridity, so persistent maintenance of the Russian identity despite the emergence of the new Kazakhstani identity. And finally, there was ambivalence, simultaneous feeling of repulsion towards the former colonizer, but at the same time, attraction to him or to her, to Russia. And then I would say that the second period, over this 35 or so years, there was also the second period, the period of neoliberal modernization and recolonization that gradually happened even during the first period, but really intensified recently. So the complexity, there was a complexity. So what was the complexity? How this complexity of this identity, complex identity of a formerly colonized nation created conditions for new recolonization and remodernization. On the one hand, there was gradual discreditation of the previous modernization project. So there was critique of Russian colonization, more voices, what harm it may have done, in addition to doing some goods. At the same time, as more people started to go abroad and more ideas were expressed by all sorts of experts from abroad, there was valorization of the Western model of academia as more efficient and effective and in promotion of neoliberal mechanisms. So the system moved from centralization to decentralization of university and research governance and finance, from public ownership to privatization of education and industries that were driving research, from equalizing social distribution to competitive market mechanism. And these mechanisms were introduced, for example, in competitive distribution of research grants and study grants at universities. So both individuals and universities were now put in the position of competing against each other. Introduction of university rankings as a mechanism to maintain this competition and the mechanism of quality control. Outcome-based mechanisms of performance evaluation in individual research, but also in institutional research, which are reflected in doctoral degree conferral and in salary and promotion mechanisms. There was also a move from isolation as a state and as a research system within a non-competitive internal or regional market, which was more characteristic for the Soviet period, to internationalization as part of integration into international higher education and research markets. There was a move from local system of knowledge dissemination to integration in the global system of knowledge dissemination, and a move from efforts aimed at strengthening Kazakhstan to Kazakh to promotion of English as a lingua franca, including the language of communication in research. I also think that one of the main mechanisms of this neo-colonial academic or neo-colonial academic modernization or academic colonization was actually the creation of the world-class university, or Nazarbayev University, and associated systems of Nazarbayev intellectual schools. The reason I think about this way is because prior to 2007, when the plans for the creation of Nazarbayev University were announced, Bolashak was an important mechanism of change that drove modernization, but it was very different from the contemporary remodernization project, because at the early days of Bolshak, the government sent Bolshak students around the world, to Asia, to Europe. It was seeking for solutions from every part of the world. And when Bolshak scholars came back to Kazakhstan, they brought a variety of ideas, and the government was experimenting with different ideas, it was learning from different systems. So there was some agency in determination of the country's fate. In 2007, the government bought into this neocolonial discourse of the transformative power of world-class universities, the blue chips in the business of education, the drivers of innovation as they are presented in the Western discourse. And so they wanted to achieve economic growth and competitiveness with the help of the creation of Nazarbayev University. And Nazarbayev University became the main catalyst of this neoliberal reforms in research policy, which led to reorientation of all reforms now towards the West. In fact, towards probably most likely two specific countries, like Britain and the United States, where most of the partners came from, partners of Nazarbayev University. And this gradually led to the changed balance of colonial powers in the overlaid semi-periphery. So if in the past Kazakhstan was kind of trying to balance between Russia, China, and the West, I think with the creation of Nazarbayev University, it became completely oriented to the West, mostly oriented to the West. And that contributed to accelerated implementation of neoliberal practices in the country. Now, so you now have my view of the history of how this modernization project or educational reforms occurring in the overlapping semi-periphery were happening in Kazakhstan over 35 years. What was the dynamics? Now what I want to talk about is how these reforms affected the status of scholars. And the fact is that this effect was not homogeneous. It actually affected scholars differently depending on their background. And so let's talk, first of all, about Western educated scholars. So these were mostly graduates of the Bolshak program or individuals that studied for PhD degrees or master's degrees at the expense of universities abroad or via different programs that were established by the US and European Union after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. These individuals usually have complex identity. Some of these parts of this identity arise from their Kazakhstani education and some from Western education. As a result, they are able to understand values and norms of both systems. They are capable to function as successful scholars at the international level. Many of them understand the ropes of academic publishing and with some pains at the beginning are able to reintegrate to this international discourse and produce papers that are oriented to the Western reader. They are also actively publishing and attracting grants. They are capable of serving as role models and mentors for the new generation of scholars, and many of them work at Nazarbayev University or at other universities in Kazakhstan. And from my research on doctoral students, I can see that they play an important role in cultivating this new generation of scholars who didn't have a chance to go abroad. They are frequently perceived as brokers or assets by both local and Western partners. They are desirable employees at Western-style universities, but also at the top Kazakhstani local universities. And because they are perceived as brokers, even if they are interested in pursuing research careers, both Western partners and Kazakhstani Kazakhstani university leaders tend to look at them mostly as highly qualified for administrative positions. So their problem is that they're always redirected to these administrative positions and administrative roles. And of course, having to perform this administrative load, in addition to teaching load, reduces their chances of being successful as researchers. Many of them eventually leave the research career or try to, again, produce a kind of some sort of they try to produce an impression that they are doing research, but they never have a chance to become fully functioning researchers. They are also perceived as a threat by both local and Western partners. And as a result, they have difficulty readjusting to domestic research environment, because if there's only one Western trained scholar at a local university, very often they are like lots of local faculty members look suspicious at them, and they are afraid that they will quickly grow in administrative ranks or quickly make them irrelevant with their successful publications. So local faculty do not support the scholars and in fact create problems for them when they go to local universities. But then if they go to Western universities, they tend to be discriminated by international faculty because they're also perceived as a threat. They understand the local context to much greater extent. They can make connections to those people who make decisions in the government level or at the university level and who have local origin. And at Nazarbayev University, for example, I had a sense of increasing discourse among international faculty that all of these Western trained or internationally trained Kazakhstani PhD scholars are not as qualified as any other PhD student who studied in the West, for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes they would say that, well, because they received funding from Bolashak, they didn't know English well. Universities were more willingly accepting them for studies, and as a result, they were not quality students to begin with. Or another argument would be that students had to return home immediately after their PhD degrees, so they never had a chance to be postdocs, and as a result, they don't have as much knowledge and skills as any other graduate. Or such ideas as, for example, because the students were funded, they never really had to work as research assistants or teaching assistants, or didn't have a chance from universities, and as a result, they didn't gain as much experience and skills as any other PhD student who had to fight for their survival and for money and was hired on multiple research projects. So all sorts of reasons are provided. And if you look objectively at the experience of lots of Bolashak students who were trying to land jobs at Nazarbayev University, most of them are stuck at postdoc positions, and once they finish their postdoc positions, they wait and never hired as faculty members and have to leave and work, either leave academia or work in other institutions. So eventually, when these individuals are disillusioned about the system, they assume three types of agency. In some of my papers, I showed how sometimes these postdoctoral scholars at Nazarbayev University, for example, they unified and they started to lobby their interests. And they kind of mobilized and started to present themselves as Young Researchers Association. They gained power at the ministry. And then once they had the voice at the ministry, they were kind of fighting the old generation of scholars, gradually I think they were the reason why some of the funding systems for research have transformed, why Academy of Science in the original version was closed. And ultimately, once they gained the voice as a group at the ministry level, and remember, everybody look at them as an asset, they still understand the Western system more. So they gradually started to gain control. But the problem is, those of them who were lobbying at the government level, eventually some of them left research because they became preoccupied with this leadership roles, administrative roles, and that distracted them from their research. And those of them who continued to be successful eventually left the groups, the lobbying groups. Another type of agency is that the individuals would just leave the careers and scholarship and move to leadership roles, either in the corporate sector or NGO sector or in the government, to make a change and to gain access to resources. And finally, there were some who immigrated from the country to build their careers elsewhere. Another type of scholars are Russian-educated scholars. So these ones graduated, so I'm keeping track of time, and I can see that I'm actually used up lots of time already. So these are graduates of Central Soviet and modern Russian universities. These benefited from internal inferiority complex of Kazakhstani academia, leading, because very often they were leading up until the beginning of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, to a widespread perception of a high value and quality of Russian education and research. So because everybody before the war believed that that was the case, the students or scholars were perceived as better than any of the local scholars. They were capable of demonstrating a high level of research productivity as defined in the old colonial Soviet times by publishing in Russian journals and by collaborating with Russian scholars. They were also perceived as brokers or assets, this time by Russian and local universities, because they could help build valuable connections with Russian universities and scholars that universities were expected to build by the government and often relied upon because of dominant knowledge of the Russian language versus English language. They were also frequently perceived as second-rate collaborators by the Russians. And we're performing marginal roles on the projects in the same way as this would happen in the relationships with Western scholars. They were perceived as less capable than the Western educated peers due to the emerging hierarchy of colonial academias. So if you kind of talk to most of the scholars in Kazakhstan, everybody thinks that the main valuable orienteer for the system to change is the West, and then it's Russia, and then some other countries, like, for example, Malaysia, Singapore, like Asian tigers, and finally Kazakhstan. And they were still benefiting from high likelihood of being funded, promoted to leadership positions, or being involved in policy decision-making. But after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, many of them assumed a new form of agency. Now they are trying to actively reposition and clean themselves from affiliation with the aggressor, cutting or loosening ties with their former Russian colleagues, engaging in new local and international initiatives. Some of them, if they have less success publishing in Western journals, they start to launch new Kazakhstani journals, try to bring them into databases, increase their rankings, ultimately leveraging old connections and skills, and the weakening of Russian partners to initiate new international partnerships. So like in one of the studies that I conducted about the effects of war and internationalization in the post-Soviet region, one of the findings was that the war prevented Russians from engaging into former strong international collaborations and receiving some funding. And some of this funding is now redirected to Central Asia and Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan, of course, emerged as a leader in Central Asia, attracting the international funding and starting and leading some of the comparative initiatives, research initiatives in the region. And so those who were engaged with relationships with Russia, they are now kind of stepping up and assuming this leadership instead of their Russian colleagues. And finally, there are these locally educated, or we could call them indigenous academics. So these are graduates of local universities. Frequently, they are the only carriers of the really indigenous epistemologies and like individuals who know language much better than those who focus their efforts on learning English or Russian speaking scholars. This especially strengthened in the early days of independence. Many of them lack understanding of the lingua franca. Also, they have little understanding of Western research methods, theories, cultural references, knowledge dissemination systems, and novel competitive research funding practices. They are very disoriented in the contemporary world. They lack opportunities of international mobility and international networks. They are perceived and painted as inferior, lagging behind, and needing retraining and mentorship. But these are common labels that are put on any indigenous populations in any colonized country. They are also having trouble publishing in international journals due to deficiencies listed above and colonial attitudes of the journal editors towards Southern and English limited authors writing on Southern topics. They also have trouble assessing doctoral students, grants, and leadership positions, and as a result of lack of access to resources, they are perpetually stuck in this marginalized position. They assume three forms of agency. The older generations usually, they don't have much time left before they retire, and so they don't want to invest much efforts into retraining. They are left with no choice but to engage in mimicry. So they try to produce an impression of doing science, engaging in this predatory publishing, ghost authorship, paid publication, corruption, and other forms of research misconduct. There's also younger generation who are seeking for internationally educated mentors to quickly learn the new ropes of the game and to catch up. Point three is that there are also scholars very often in humanities and social sciences, historians, anthropologists, philologists, political scientists sometimes, who start to talk about decoloniality. But currently, most of this decoloniality, unfortunately, is only in relation to the legacies of the Russian domination. And there are very few scholars who are talking about modern neocolonial influences from the West. So now, what are my concluding thoughts? Kazakhstani academia, about Kazakhstani academia as an arena of neocolonial contestation. As I said, Kazakhstan's unique status as an overlapping semi-periphery leads to several things. It creates a complex system of dependencies where scholars and policymakers have to sort out ambiguity and engage in constant renegotiation and balancing act and mimicry. So we actually have, Kazakhstan has always been quoted for geopolitical balancing between different powers. And very often we talked about this balancing only in terms of economy and political relationships. But in reality, it happens in research too, in science. Also, it led to the formation of internal hierarchies of academics with different levels of marginalization and liminality. It also led to increasing internal competition and erosion of collaboration and camaraderie necessary for unification as a mechanism for strengthening agency and resistance. It stalled development of indigenous epistemologies and local systems of knowledge disseminations, as in other colonized countries. It also led to non-culminating process of integration into the global knowledge production and dissemination systems, persisting invisibility of Kazakhstani research and scholars on the global arena, increasing dependence of the system of knowledge production and innovation on external players and Western-style institutions, employing mostly external players and utilizing external business and education processes. And this has led to further weakening of the locally designed and relevant systems of education and research, and thus deepening of the potentially irreversible dependency cycle. So the weaker the educational system, or the weaker it's perceived, the weaker is research system. That weakens the economy and the ability of the economy to get out from the resource dependence, and that increases dependency and external reliance. At the same time, Kazakhstan's unique status as an overlapping periphery leads to areas of ambiguity and loosened colonial control. So if there are three powers competing, there are always leeways which create opportunities for agency. In addition to that, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has brought disillusionment with the big brother and led to the emergence of decolonial discourse, which has not been present in the past. And although now it applies only to Russia, I can imagine that in the near future, it will start to get applied. People will start to think critically about other types of colonization. And then the recent initiatives of President Trump's administration and the associated global economic effects might have shattered some previous beliefs about the modernizing role of the West, while also contributing to the growing interest in pursuing stronger connections with China. And I can already see that if you take Nazarbayev University, that was completely oriented to the West, is now trying to develop connections with Asia, with China in particular. So there is still no clarity on where Kazakhstan will find itself as a result of the global transitions and how much agency local players and scholars may lose or regain in the process. So came to the end of my presentation. I'm looking forward to hearing questions from you now, or comments, reflections.
Thank you, Aliya, for the presentation. I will stop the recording now and a second.